this video, I'm going to be explaining some basic principles of working with wood grain. Now, I don't want you to feel too bogged down by the theory behind wood carving. At the end of the day, the more you practice carving, the more it becomes an intuitive process. However, it is useful to know which way the grain is running in each of your carving pieces. This way, you'll come to understand how wood behaves depending on the direction of the grain. So I'm going to guide you through this, and I'm also going to flag up some technical terms I'll be using in the videos. Inside your carving kits, you will find a block of wood. And inside that block of wood is the body carving blank. The grain of the wood runs lengthways along the block. The tree grew in the same direction as the grain. This means that if you look at the end of the block of wood, you will see the tree's growth rings. When carving, we call this the end grain. Here is the carving blank from inside the block. The wood grain runs along the length of the body. It has been designed this way for strength. If the grain ran vertically, for example, the beak could split along the grain and break off. I always consider vulnerable areas like this when I'm deciding which way to put the grain for a design. Just remember, with the grain equals strength. Every carving blank, even though it's based on the same design, will be a bit different. The behaviour of the grain will vary, depending on where in the tree the piece is from. For example, it might be from near the heartwood. Or it might be from near the edge of the tree, near the bark. Also, some trees have more irregular grain than others. It might be wavier and more erratic. There will always be variables in the grain. So I want to give you the heads up that your carving blanks might behave a little bit differently from mine in the videos, and this will be down to those variables. This isn't something to worry about, it's just something to be aware of as you're carving this project. Wood is never a perfectly uniform material to work with, so it does require a little bit of patience. Having said all of that, the type of wood we're going to use for this project is actually a really reliable wood for carving. The carving blanks are cut from European lime wood, which is a very similar species to American lime wood, otherwise known as basswood. There are 4 reasons why I like working with this wood and why it's great for beginner carvers. Number 1, it is tight-grained, so it takes detail well, because it's less likely to split. Number 2, compared to other trees, the grain behaves very consistently, so it's a much more predictable wood to work with than other woods, which means it's particularly good for beginner carvers. Number 3, it's much softer to work than other woods, which makes it easy to carve. Oak, for example, is a very hard, very dense wood, and can be very difficult to carve. Number 4, it is lighter than a lot of other woods, which makes it a great wood for carving puppets. A puppet carved from a heavier wood like oak would be too heavy to operate. In your carving kits, the grain runs along the length of the wings. And down the length of the tail pieces. There are different techniques for working with wood grain. Sometimes we'll be carving with the grain. For example, here I'm carving the top side of the wings by carving with the grain. Carving with the grain can often create a nice polished finish. Sometimes we'll be carving across the grain. For example, here I am carving the underside of the swallow wing by carving across the grain. Sometimes carving across the grain gives you a bit more control. Of course, sometimes we'll carve diagonally across the grain, as a compromise between the two. For example, here I am carving the underside of the goldfinch wing by carving diagonally across the grain. Which technique you use will depend on how your grain is behaving. We will rarely carve directly into end grain, because end grain is very tough to carve. Here is one rare exception. I'm carving into the neck of the bird. You'll see that the shavings are gathering where I'm hitting into end grain. Sometimes we'll be carving curved shapes. To do so, we will always carve downhill with the grain. If you try carving uphill, you'll be hitting into end grain, which will be much harder to carve. For example, when we carve the bird's belly, we'll be carving downhill from the top of the hill as shown here. You can also carve downhill into valleys, which is how I refer to concave shapes. Again, if you try carving uphill, you will hit into end grain. For example, when we come to carve the edges of the wings, we'll be carving downhill into the valley as shown. That's all for now on wood grain. Like I said at the beginning of this video, don't get too hung up on the theory. You'll find your understanding of wood develops intuitively over time. Just remember which way the grain is running in each of your carving pieces.